What's the one thing you'd say to your younger self before your first betrayal?
Are you ready for a shocking truth? You do not have a family business if there is no paper, and yet my parents acted as if every late-night conversation around our kitchen table counted as some kind of legally binding partnership. When I started my small analytics studio, it was just me, my laptop, and a handful of clients who believed I could help them make sense of their marketing numbers. I paid my own rent. I bought my own software, I signed my own contracts, and yet from the very beginning my parents insisted on inserting themselves into my work as if the whole operation somehow belonged to all of us. They gave advice freely, often contradictory and unhelpful, and made comments about our company, even though they never signed a single document or put in a single dollar. At first, I brushed it off because I wanted to keep the peace and because a part of me was still that daughter who wanted her parents to be proud of her. The turning point came when my little studio actually started turning into something real. I had 3 retainer clients locked in, my first year of revenue covered my bills and even left me with some breathing room, and I finally felt like I was running a business instead of clinging to a hobby. That is when the tone from my parents changed from vague support to an entitlement that I had never agreed to. They began saying things like, "We always knew our family venture would succeed," or, "When the profits start rolling in, we will all finally see the rewards." It stunned me because, to me, there was no we in the picture. There was me, alone at midnight drafting pitch decks and teaching myself how to manage taxes, and there was them, occasionally texting unsolicited advice that I politely acknowledged before going back to the grind. I thought maybe they were just exaggerating, but soon it became clear they genuinely believed that what I had created was theirs too. My mother told relatives at Thanksgiving that she and my father had launched a consulting firm through Lauren, as if I were an employee or an avatar. My father told one of his old friends from construction that we are in the analytics business now. I tried to laugh it off, but deep down I was alarmed. I decided then to stop being naive. I sat down with a local attorney for a 30-minute consultation and asked what protections I needed if people ever tried to claim what I had built. His advice was blunt: form the LLC, open a separate bank account, get a tax ID, and file a trademark. It sounded boring, but also like the only way to put boundaries where none existed. So I did exactly that. I filed the LLC paperwork, I opened a clean business account, and I filed for an intent-to-use trademark on my brand name. I did not tell my parents any of this because frankly I knew it would set them off, but I needed the protection. For the first time, I felt like I had an actual wall around my work. Then, just a few weeks later, the hammer dropped. A letter showed up from a law office I had never heard of, written on stiff paper, accusing me of stealing a family concept, demanding back pay, and insisting that my parents were entitled to a permanent share of revenue. They even used the phrase family venture in the letter as if saying it enough times could turn it into something real. At first, my chest went tight. I thought maybe I had missed something, maybe there was some legal trap in the way I described things. But then I forced myself to sit down and read the letter slowly. It demanded proof of partnership, but offered none. It talked about oral agreements, which I knew from my consultation meant nothing in the face of actual contracts and registrations. So instead of panicking, I did something simple. I wrote one email back. In it, I asked them to please provide any signed agreements, invoices, receipts, or proof of investment that tied them legally to my company. I knew they had none, and that silence would tell me everything. That email was my first small act of revenge. It was not loud or angry. It was precise and boring, and it forced them to reveal they had nothing but talk. The silence stretched on for weeks, which told me the bluff was crumbling. During that time, I took another step. I found out about a free small business legal clinic run by the county, the kind where volunteer attorneys walk new owners through the basics. I signed up, figuring I needed as much reinforcement as I could get. When I walked in, I expected it to be awkward, maybe too generic to be useful. Instead, I found myself sitting across from a guest instructor who picked up my file, flipped through the copies of my LLC papers and trademark filing, and gave me a nod. "Most people never bother," he said, tapping the page. "You did the hard part already. Keep your emails. You are going to need them." His name was David Morales. At the time, I thought he was just another volunteer passing through. I did not know I would hear his voice again in a courtroom, with my parents staring at me across the aisle. When I woke up the next morning and checked my phone, I could already tell from the flood of unread messages that my quiet little sunset had managed to throw gasoline on whatever illusion of control Lauren thought she had over me. She had posted in the group chat late at night, tagging my name in bold letters, writing things like, "Maya clearly chose strangers over family, and she wants attention. Otherwise, why post something like that on a holiday?" I sat there reading every line slowly, not because her words hurt, but because they revealed something much more important, the narrative she was building, the story she wanted the rest of the family to believe, one where I was ungrateful, dramatic, and disloyal, while she remained the one who sacrificed and organized everything. I knew this tactic well, because Lauren had always been skilled at twisting any disagreement into evidence of her martyrdom, and in the past, I had either gone silent or tried to defend myself until everyone begged me to stop. But this time I had no interest in defending. This time, I wanted documentation. So when she accused me of choosing strangers, I typed one calm sentence back. "Lauren, can you please send me the ledger for the Traditions Fund so I can review what I've already contributed?" The silence that followed was almost louder than the outburst before it. Nobody replied. My mother dropped a nervous, "Let's not complicate this," and my father quickly sent, "We'll talk later." But I didn't delete the question. I left it sitting there, plain, impossible to ignore, because if Lauren wanted to paint me as the selfish outsider, then she would also have to explain why she controlled a fund that supposedly existed for the benefit of everyone but was never once transparent. Later that afternoon, while lounging on a chair with my laptop, I opened the screenshots I had quietly collected over the years. Every time Lauren sent us a Venmo request labeled Tradition Supplies or Holiday Prep, I had noticed the small line of text beneath that sometimes gave away the merchant's name. One was a luxury spa not even located in our town. Another was a boutique clothing store where she liked to buy expensive shoes. These had stuck in my head as odd, but I never brought them up because every time I questioned her before, she managed to twist it into me being bitter or jealous. Now, though, those screenshots were no longer just odd details. They were evidence. I typed another message, careful and polite. "I am happy to cover dessert this year if you'll just share the report from the fund so I can settle my part fairly." The wording was intentional. It sounded generous, cooperative, even conciliatory. But beneath that surface, it was bait, because to accept my offer she would have to acknowledge that a ledger existed, and to reject it she would have to show her hand as the gatekeeper who never intended to share anything. Hours went by before she finally responded, and her reply was short but telling, "You have no standing. The fund is for families who host." That single line did more for me than any argument could have, because it confirmed what I had suspected all along, that she had redrawn the definition of family to mean only herself, her husband, and her children, while I was treated as an outsider whose money was welcome, but whose presence was optional. I decided not to argue back. Instead, I opened an old box of my grandmother's things that I had brought with me almost by accident. I had stuffed it into my suitcase at the last minute, thinking maybe I would feel closer to her if I looked through her notes while sitting alone on the beach. Inside the box were recipe cards, handwritten letters, and tucked between two envelopes, a faded piece of paper where she had scribbled a line about the Traditions Trust. It wasn't the full document, but it clearly said, "Funds shall be used for gatherings that include all grandchildren." I stared at those words until I felt a strange mix of relief and fury. Relief, because here was proof that my exclusion was against the very spirit of what Grandma had wanted. Fury, because it meant Lauren had not only twisted the rules, but had been doing so while invoking Grandma's name as if she were honoring her wishes. I snapped a photo of that faded line and posted it in the group chat with one calm sentence. "Interesting." Grandma's words said everyone. I didn't add commentary, didn't accuse anyone directly, didn't raise my voice. I let the paper speak for itself. Within minutes, my phone started buzzing again. My mother called, my father texted asking if I really had the original, and Lauren wrote in all caps, "That's not what she meant." But I had already planted the seed. They all knew I wasn't bluffing. That night, I sat on the balcony of my room and scrolled through the chat again, watching the panic unfold in real time. They tried to change the subject, to guilt me about posting family matters out of context, to lecture me about respect, but none of that mattered anymore, because for the first time the weight of proof wasn't on me. It was on them. They had spent years telling me I wasn't a real part of the family, and now, with one old line of Grandma's handwriting, I had flipped the entire argument. And yet, I didn't show everything. I still had the screenshots, the questionable Venmo charges, and the suspicion that the fund had been used for things that had nothing to do with holidays at all. That was my next move, but for now, I let the silence do its work. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do isn't to scream or argue, but to hold up a mirror and make people look at what they'd rather ignore. Tomorrow I would take the box of Grandma's things to Evelyn, because if anyone could make sense of the numbers and the rules, it was her. And once we pulled on that thread, I had a feeling the entire fabric of Lauren's control would unravel. When the lawsuit was officially filed and I had finished dissecting the complaint word by word, I understood that ignoring them was no longer an option, because now the situation had shifted from gossip and threats into the formal arena of law where documents, filings, and deadlines determined survival, and this meant I needed to take every precaution possible while also making sure that I never allowed myself to be cornered into desperate decisions. Their attorney, a woman named Marla Benton, quickly sent over a so-called settlement offer, though anyone with even the slightest awareness of legal maneuvering would have recognized it for what it was: extortion written in polished legal language. The letter proposed that I hand over a percentage of my company, allow my parents to be recognized as founding partners, and pay them back wages for years in which, apparently, their unsolicited advice was supposed to count as labor. The numbers they named were laughable, but the real insult was the audacity of the claim, because it was built entirely on conversations that had no weight in any real-world sense. I did not respond immediately, because I knew the power of silence when used at the right time, and instead I scheduled a limited-scope consultation with a local attorney who specialized in small business disputes. I was upfront about my resources, explaining that I could not afford full representation for a drawn-out fight, but that I needed someone to help me prepare filings and coach me through the process so that I would not be blindsided. To my relief, he agreed to work with me on those terms, and together we began drafting a motion to dismiss. It was not glamorous work, but it was meticulous, and I knew that every hour I spent gathering receipts, highlighting contracts, and formatting exhibits was another step toward dismantling the illusion my parents were trying to present. In the motion, we included the essentials: my operating agreement, copies of contracts signed directly with clients under my LLC, bank statements showing all revenue flowing into my company account, and dated emails where I alone pitched and negotiated deals. On top of that, I included attachments that seemed boring at first glance, but were powerful in context: meeting notes, invoices, and even time-stamped presentations created on my personal account that had nothing to do with my parents. All of it painted a picture of a business that had always been mine alone, with no shadow partners hiding in the wings. But I did not stop there, because I had learned that court battles are not only about presenting your case, but also about keeping the other side aware of the risks they face. While combing through public records and prior cases, I noticed that Marla Benton, their attorney, had previously represented a college roommate of mine in a dispute over a lease years ago. That case was minor, but the fact remained that she should have checked for conflicts before accepting representation against me. I also discovered something else. Her decision to file a claim without requesting ownership documents from my parents first put her at risk of a bar complaint for pursuing a case without proper verification. I knew I did not want to launch into nuclear tactics unless pushed, but I also knew the value of making her aware that I had these arrows in my quiver. So I drafted a calm, professional email, carefully reviewed by my consulting attorney, in which I laid out the deficiencies in the complaint, provided citations to my filings, and then, in a single understated paragraph, referenced the fact that I had concerns about conflicts and professional responsibility. I never threatened, I never ranted. I simply made it clear that I knew exactly where the cracks in her case were, and that I was prepared to address them formally if necessary. The power in that email was not in volume or anger, but in the way it held up a mirror to her, forcing her to recognize that this was not going to be the easy payday she and my parents had likely imagined. Once that was done, I focused on building what I began to call my lockbox, a sealed appendix of evidence that told the full story in chronological order, so clear that even someone with no background in the situation would be able to see the truth immediately. At the heart of this timeline was a line from my father, preserved in writing, where he had said, "We will sign later. Do not slow her down with paperwork." That one sentence, which at the time had seemed like a casual brush-off, now served as undeniable proof that no formal agreement had ever existed, because his own words acknowledged the absence of signatures. To strengthen the narrative further, I included my trademark filing documents, complete with the dates that showed my priority of use months before they even began talking about a so-called family venture. Every piece of paper was a brick in the wall I was building to protect myself. Then, just as I was beginning to feel like I might actually have a chance at shutting this down, the hearing notice arrived in my inbox, and when I saw the name of the assigned judge, my pulse skipped. Judge David Morales. The same man who had once looked me in the eye at the small business clinic and told me that I had already done the hardest part by filing the paperwork most people ignored. For a moment, panic flared, because I worried about whether this prior connection might create complications. I immediately told my attorney, explaining that I had once attended a clinic where he was a guest instructor and that we had never spoken outside of that context. My attorney reassured me that as long as we disclosed it openly, there would be no problem, because attending a public clinic did not constitute a personal relationship. Still, the coincidence rattled me, because it felt like the universe was reminding me that all of those boring steps I had taken, steps my parents mocked us, unnecessary, were about to pay off in a way I had never anticipated. In that moment, as I sat staring at the hearing notice, I realized something crucial. My parents thought they were dragging me into a fight I could not win, but what they had actually done was walk straight into a courtroom where the judge already knew the value of the precautions I had taken, because he had been the one teaching them. It was not favoritism, it was recognition of competence. And for the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to breathe deeply, because I knew that if I stayed disciplined, if I resisted the urge to lash out emotionally, and if I trusted the structure I had built, I could walk into that hearing with my head high. The hearing date was set, and while my parents probably thought they had cornered me, what they had really done was open the door to a stage where the truth could finally be laid bare. And as I closed my laptop that night, I could not shake the thought that the name at the bottom of that notice might just change everything. The weeks leading up to the hearing were not simply about filing motions and reviewing exhibits, because my parents had decided that if they could not win by law alone, they would attempt to win by waging a reputational war that played out on social media and in community circles, and in some ways that was the part that stung the most. My mother, Elaine, began posting long and carefully crafted monologues on her Facebook page, weaving a story about betrayal, sacrifice, and a daughter who had supposedly turned her back on the very people who had raised her. She avoided specific legal claims so she could not be sued for defamation, but she painted herself and my father as victims of greed and arrogance, and the comments beneath her posts were filled with sympathetic replies from people who had no idea of the truth. Reading them was like being stabbed repeatedly with the same dull knife, because the people chiming in with "stay strong" and "family is everything" had no idea that the woman they were comforting was actively trying to dismantle my livelihood. I wanted desperately to write my own posts, to clear my name, to explain in painstaking detail how none of what she was claiming was backed by evidence, but every time I drafted something, I deleted it. I reminded myself that engaging on their level would only feed their narrative, and that every word I put into the public sphere could be twisted and used against me in court. Instead, I opted for discipline. One single neutral statement posted on my business page, where I simply wrote that the matter was before the court, that all services were provided under my registered company, and that I remained committed to my clients. It was short, calm, and professional, and though it did not give me the emotional release I craved, it positioned me as the stable party while my parents flailed publicly. At the same time, I realized that reputation is not just about words on social media, but also about the credibility you build through third parties. So I quietly contacted an old professor who had mentored me during my graduate program. She now wrote for a business magazine that occasionally profiled small companies, and when I explained in broad strokes that I was dealing with a legal dispute over ownership, but preferred not to go into details until it was resolved, she offered to write a general piece about the importance of women founders protecting themselves through clear paperwork. The article would not mention names, but it would highlight the exact kind of steps I had taken: forming an LLC, registering a trademark, and maintaining dated contracts. We agreed to hold the piece until the case was finished, but knowing it was waiting in the wings gave me a kind of reassurance that the truth would eventually find its way out without me having to scream it into the void. Meanwhile, my clients began to hear whispers, and some of them grew nervous. Jared Cole, who had already agreed to sign an affidavit confirming our work relationship, called me late one evening sounding hesitant. He said he did not want his name dragged into family drama and asked if he was making things worse by agreeing to help. I reassured him that his statement was purely factual, that it contained no commentary about my parents, and that it was limited to dates, deliverables, and invoices. I sent him the draft affidavit again, with every line carefully constructed to stay within professional boundaries, and after reading it once more, he agreed to sign. His support was more valuable than he realized, because it showed that, even in the face of manufactured chaos, I could count on the people I had actually built relationships with. As the hearing drew closer, the pressure from my parents intensified. I received messages from relatives warning me that my parents were preparing to go public with something that would destroy me, though they would not specify what. Then, the night before the hearing, an email arrived from Marla, their attorney, with a subject line that read, "Final opportunity to resolve." Inside was a last-ditch settlement proposal. They demanded a payout far lower than before, clearly sensing their case was unraveling, but they still insisted on partial ownership of my brand, and worse, they threatened to release a story accusing me of embezzling funds if I refused. The word embezzlement sent a shock through me, because it was such a loaded accusation, the kind that could ruin a reputation even if proven false. But once I steadied my breathing and forced myself to think rationally, I realized the threat was empty. Months earlier, when I had begun assembling my lockbox of evidence, I had engaged a forensic accountant to review my records and confirm that every transaction was clean. The accountant had written a short letter verifying that no funds had been misused and that all expenses and revenues aligned with standard practices. That letter now sat in my sealed appendix, ready to be used if necessary, and knowing it existed gave me strength. Their threat was like a shadow puppet on the wall, frightening at first glance, but powerless when light was shined on it. Still, I recognized the brilliance of responding not with panic but with precision. So instead of lashing out or writing a long rebuttal, I forwarded their email to my attorney, attached the forensic accountant's letter, and instructed him to add the exchange to the retaliation section of our filings. Then I sent a single-line reply back to Marla, "I will address this in court." That was it, no anger, no elaboration, just a calm acknowledgement that I was not intimidated. That night, as I prepared my notes and double-checked my exhibits, I felt a strange clarity settle over me. I understood that my parents were no longer simply trying to claim what they thought was theirs. They were willing to fabricate entire stories to destroy me if it meant regaining control. But I also understood that their desperation was evidence of their weakness. They had no contracts, no investments, no paper trail, and now they were resorting to threats that I had already neutralized. The truth was simple. They wanted me scared, and for years I probably would have been. But in that moment, on the eve of the hearing, I realized I was done being polite, done being the daughter who kept quiet to avoid conflict, done letting their voices drown out my own. Tomorrow, I would walk into a courtroom not as a child seeking approval, but as a business owner defending what she had built. And no matter how hard they tried to rattle me, I knew that the structure I had assembled would stand firm, because unlike them, I had built it on paper, on proof, and on truth. The morning of the hearing arrived with a heaviness that was difficult to put into words, because it was not only the weight of facing my parents across a courtroom, but also the recognition that this was the culmination of months of maneuvering, preparation, and silent endurance, and no matter the outcome, something fundamental in our relationship would be broken forever. I walked into the courthouse with my attorney, carrying the binders I had prepared with such care, each page marked with tabs and notes so that I could locate any piece of evidence in seconds. My parents were already there, sitting with Marla, their attorney, and when my mother's eyes met mine, she did not glare with anger or soften with regret. She looked at me with the cold calculation of someone who had convinced herself that she was entitled to win. My father avoided eye contact altogether, fidgeting with his papers as if shuffling them could somehow make their claims real. When Judge Morales entered and took his seat, the room quieted, and he began the roll call of the cases scheduled for the day. When he reached ours, he said my first name clearly, in the same steady tone he used for everyone else, but the sound of it carried differently across the room. My parents stiffened instantly, because to them it must have sounded like familiarity, like an acknowledgement that the judge knew me personally. They did not know that the only connection we shared was the legal clinic where he had once reviewed my filings and told me I had done the hard part most people ignored. For me, it was a small reassurance that my preparation had not been wasted, but for them, it was the moment they realized the battle they had chosen was already tilted against them, not because of favoritism, but because they had never had a real case to begin with. The proceedings began with Marla presenting their claims, and I listened carefully as she tried to weave the narrative of a family venture that had supposedly existed in spirit, even if not on paper. She spoke of long dinners where strategic decisions were made, of countless hours of parental guidance, and of the shared understanding that my company was meant to be a Pierce family endeavor. It was dramatic, it was emotional, and it was utterly unsupported by evidence. When Judge Morales asked her directly whether she could present a single signed agreement transferring ownership, her words faltered, because the answer was no. He pressed again. Did she have any proof of financial investment, invoices, or equity records? Again, she had nothing. My parents sat frozen, and I saw for the first time in months a flicker of doubt pass across my mother's face, though she quickly masked it with her usual composure. Then it was our turn. My attorney stood and presented the timeline we had assembled, beginning with the formation of my LLC, complete with stamped filings and tax records, moving through the contracts signed directly between my company and clients, and finishing with the trademark registration that had established my priority of use long before my parents ever raised the idea of a family venture. Each piece of evidence was methodically placed in front of the judge, and I watched as the narrative I had lived was translated into a clear legal record that could not be dismissed as opinion. When Jared Cole's affidavit was introduced, stating plainly that every pitch, contract, and deliverable had been handled by me alone, the picture was complete. My company had always been mine, and theirs had been a story invented after the fact. The most powerful moment came when my attorney read aloud the line from my father's message, "We will sign later. Do not slow her down with paperwork." The courtroom was silent because in that one sentence, he had admitted that no formal agreement existed and that everything they now claimed was simply retroactive fantasy. My father shifted uncomfortably in his seat, and my mother pressed her lips tightly together, but neither could deny that his own words undermined their case more effectively than anything I could have said. When the judge finally spoke, his tone was measured, but his conclusions were decisive. He noted that the plaintiffs had failed to provide any evidence of ownership, investment, or transfer of rights, while the defendant, me, had provided a thorough and consistent record of formation, operation, and branding. He announced that the case would be dismissed with prejudice, meaning it could not be refiled, and he acknowledged my right to seek attorney's fees. My parents looked stunned, as if the outcome had not even been within the realm of possibility for them, and for a moment I felt a pang of sorrow, because this was still my family, and yet they had chosen to treat me as an enemy. But I did not stop there, because I had learned that true victory comes not only from winning, but from ensuring that the damage cannot be repeated. My attorney presented a settlement proposal we had prepared in advance. I would not pursue their assets or fees if they agreed to sign a permanent non-disparagement agreement, retract every public claim they had made in writing, and acknowledge that my company belonged solely to me. The judge looked to their side, and after a long pause, Marla advised them to accept. They signed with shaking hands, and in that moment, the war they had started came to an end, not with me gloating, but with them binding themselves legally to silence. Outside the courtroom, my mother turned to me with eyes that no longer held triumph, but something closer to disbelief, and she asked quietly, "Did you plan all of this?" I looked at her and said, "I planned to stop apologizing." Then I walked past them without waiting for a response, because there was nothing left to say. That afternoon, I sent an email to my professor friend and told her she could lift the embargo on the article. Within a week, the piece appeared in print, praising women founders who protect their companies through discipline and paperwork, and though it never mentioned names, anyone who had followed the whispers could connect the dots. My parents did issue the retractions, though they worded them as vaguely as possible, and I doubt they ever believed what they signed. But it no longer mattered, because the terms of the agreement were ironclad. Any future breach would automatically count as an admission of falsity. I had not humiliated them publicly, I had not taken their money, and I had not screamed my story from the rooftops. Instead, I had chosen the quieter path of binding them legally and ensuring my freedom to move forward. As I returned to my office and opened my laptop to resume work with clients who still trusted me, I realized that my parents had wanted my career, my name, and my independence. But what they had ultimately signed away was the power to ever undermine me again. They wanted to win through manipulation and pressure, but I had won through patience, precision, and the refusal to be silenced. And though the scars of what they had done would remain, I knew with absolute certainty that I had walked out of that courthouse not only with my company intact, but with a truth that could never again be taken from me.